Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a major geopolitical flashpoint, one that holds a really specific key, actually, to the global oil market and, consequently to energy costs right across Europe and the U.S. We're diving deep into the escalating tensions around Venezuela and, maybe more importantly, the kind of explosive scenarios often ignored tied to potential U.S. military action.
Yeah, this is definitely high-stakes stuff. The risk here isn't like abstract, it's deeply economic, it's political, and maybe most critically, it's chemical. What's really fascinating, and our sources point this out, is this central contradiction. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven conventional oil reserves. I mean, we're talking 303 billion barrels. That's huge.
300 billion. Wow.
Yeah, something like 17% of total global reserves. It's, an energy giant on paper.
That number is just staggering. But okay, despite having 17% of the world's oil, we know Venezuela is, well, barely producing anything right now.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
the paradox. Despite all that potential, Venezuela struggles to push out maybe 1.1 million barrels per day. Now, that volume itself, it's relatively small in global terms.
Right.
But the potential for chaos in the global market, if that volume suddenly disappears or if the infrastructure gets hit, it's just disproportionately massive. And that impact comes down to the type of oil they produce.
Okay. So our mission for you in this deep dive is to really get why this sort of low volume of very specific heavy acid crude is so vital for global stability. We'll look at the political maneuvering on the ground and, crucially, the precise economic disaster often overlooked that a military conflict could kick off, especially how it hits the diesel supply chain, running straight into Europe and the U.S. Okay, let's unpack this. So to really get the stakes, we first have to look at this idea of a fragile oil colossus.
Yes.
Venezuela is basically, a giant in ruin. What exactly is keeping production so low? I mean, besides the obvious political mess.
Well, the sources are pretty clear. It's a perfect storm of chronic failures, really.
Yeah.
You've got rampant infrastructure, obsolescence pipelines, wells, processing plants. They're decades old, poorly maintained.
Mm-hmm.
Then you layer on severe international sanctions, a huge lack of investment over like the last 20 years, and perhaps the biggest piece, the sheer technical challenge of processing their specific kind of oil.
Okay, you keep stressing the technical side, the chemistry. Let's drill into that. We hear heavy crude, acid crude. For, someone listening who needs to grasp why this matters, what does that actually mean for a refinery?
Yeah, that is the absolute core technical point that shapes the geopolitical risk.
Yeah.
Venezuelan crude, especially from the Orinoco region, it's incredibly heavy, meaning it's really dense, viscous, almost like tar.
Okay.
And crucially, it's also highly acidic. It's got high concentrations of sulfur and heavy metals. Now, your standard refinery, it just can't handle that stuff.
Oh, wreck the equipment.
Basically, yeah. If you put it in a basic refinery, it'll corrode the pipes, the tanks, everything. And you get much less of the valuable products out of it anyway.
So it needs specialized facilities,
Yeah.
real specialized.
Exactly. It needs what they call high-complexity refineries. These are designed with specific equipment, things like cokers and hydrotreaters. They're built specifically to strip out those impurities, the sulfur, the metals, and basically upgrade that heavy oil into lighter, more valuable fuels, like gasoline, and, critically, diesel.
Right. Diesel. That keeps coming up.
And that's why the destination matters so much. Most of the oil Venezuela does produce now is managed through joint ventures, often with U.S. licenses, believe it or not, or gets sent to specific partners, like China, who have the right refineries.
And where are these complex refineries, the ones really optimized for this specific, nasty, acidic crude?
Primarily, they're on the U.S. Gulf Coast. Those refineries were explicitly built decades ago, actually, and fine-tuned to handle heavy, sour, cheaper crudes like Venezuela's. You can't just, swap it out one for one with the light, sweet shale oil produced domestically in the U.S.
Why not? Seems easier.
Because the refinery's entire setup, its yield structure, it's all based on that specific input chemistry. So these few heavy barrels from Venezuela, they count way more towards specific product outputs like diesel than the overall volume numbers might suggest.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting then. This unique chemical dependency, it's now fueling this incredibly volatile geopolitical situation. And Maduro, he's not ignoring the threats, right? The sources say he's actively prepping.
Oh, absolutely. He's leveraging the big global players.
Right.
Maduro has openly asked for aid from Russia, from China, Iran too, framing it as, necessary defense against potential U.S. military action. And that pulls these major external powers right into the South American strategic game.
And that whole strategic picture is shifting fast. We're seeing like a measurable uptick in U.S. military presence nearby.
That's right. Officially, this growing U.S. military footprint is explained as counter-narcotics efforts, anti-drug trafficking. But the sources we looked at, they make some significant comments. They note the scale and the positioning of these forces reminds sinisterly, that's the quote, of Russia's buildup before invading Ukraine.
Wow, that's a strong comparison.
It is. It suggests something more than just routine patrols. It implies maybe a readiness for potential large-scale escalation.
But hang on, military action against a sovereign nation sitting on 17% of the world's oil. That's a massive step. Is this just rhetoric or is there intel behind it?
Well, according to our sources, which cite some inside information, it seems like yes. There are claims coming out of U.S. military circles that suggest political clearance, maybe, has already been given for action against crime.
Any given?
Potentially. It's framed within the context of President Trump's stated readiness to radically reevaluate the whole geopolitical balance in Latin America.
Yeah.
Which makes even really disruptive scenarios seem, viable if they're deemed strategically necessary.
Okay, that is critical context. The political risk is clearly high. But still, if Venezuela's current output is only around 1 million barrels a day, couldn't the world market just absorb that loss pretty quickly, price it in? Why is the potential chaos so much bigger than the current numbers imply?
That's exactly the right question. And the answer, again, it comes back to the chemistry. Sure, volume affects global prices. But refinery operations, they run on chemistry, not just statistics. Losing that specific heavy crude means critical U.S. refineries would immediately operate less efficiently. They just can't make the same amount of fuel. Analysts might say the world's swimming in light crude, but the problem is they don't have enough of the heavy stuff, the right feedstock.
Okay, let's break down that chaos. The source material lays out 3 specific conflict scenarios. Let's walk through them. Scenario A. What if it's just limited military action? Or maybe a naval blockade?
Even that limited option, it would be pretty brutal because the targets would be laser-focused,
Right.
hitting the export terminals, hitting the crucial upgrading facilities. We're talking specifically about the massive complex at Jose. That place is vital for turning that Orinoco tar into something usable.
So what happens the minute Jose gets hit or blockaded?
Instant paralysis of crude flows. Simple as that.
Huh.
Economically, the market reaction would be violent. You'd see an immediate drastic spike in insurance premiums for any shipping in the Atlantic.
Okay.
Global Brent prices would jump, sure, but crucially, the price difference, the differential between heavy and light crude would just blow out, widen rapidly, which means any heavy crude still available becomes incredibly expensive. And the profit margins on key refined products, especially diesel, they would immediately skyrocket. That's the term used.
Wow. Okay, so that widening differential, that's basically the market screaming, we desperately need heavy oil.
All right, let's move to scenario B, a more prolonged conflict. Maybe targeted attacks on industrial sites. Now we're talking actual damage to the processing infrastructure.
Yeah, this scenario goes for the heart of that unique chemistry problem. Key upstream facilities, specific plants like Petropier and Petromanagas, they get damaged. That knocks out a big chunk of the country's already limited, complex processing capacity.
And the knock-on effect of that.
It severely worsens the structural heavy crude shortage across the whole Atlantic basin. Now, could OPEC Plus theoretically pump more oil to make up the volume? Maybe. But our source material really emphasizes the quality of that substitute oil just wouldn't be the same.
Right, back to the chemistry.
Exactly. That substitute crude, it would force those U.S. Gulf refineries to run differently, less efficiently, leading to 2 very clear results for you, the consumer. Significantly more expensive diesel in Europe, and much lower fuel yields from those complex U.S. refineries. Okay, and then the worst case, scenario C. The goal is actual regime change. How do the sources see that playing out, given how catastrophic it sounds for the market?
Well, the sources definitely acknowledge the catastrophic outcome, but they frame the action itself as maybe a genuine possibility in the current geopolitical climate, the result of actually trying for regime change. It would be, quote, total chaos in the energy sector, complete logistical collapse, all foreign investment vanishes overnight. And rebuilding Venezuela's energy infrastructure, which remember is already falling apart, that would take years and just billions and billions of dollars just to get back to the current low production levels.
So whether it's a limited strike, a blockade, or full-on regime change, the specific weak point is always that heavy crude supply feeding the U.S. Gulf Coast. Let's trace that chaos across the Atlantic, then. What's the immediate domino effect on fuel prices in Europe?
Yeah, it comes right back to that chemistry problem we talked about. U.S. light shale oil just cannot replace Venezuelan heavy crude without major, immediate negative impacts on the output of those Gulf Coast refineries. They were built for density, for sulfur removal, not for the light sweet stuff everyone thinks is plentiful.
I get that the U.S. refineries need that specific heavy feedstock. But how stressed are they already, even without a new conflict?
They're operating under significant stress right now, actually. U.S. Gulf refineries are already importing more high-sulfur residues and fuel oil, basically the gunk left at the bottom of the barrel, to try and compensate for a heavy crude deficit. A deficit that's grown because of two things: sanctions, cutting off Russian Urals, another heavy crude, and Venezuela's ongoing low output. So any new disruption from Venezuela,
Yeah.
it pushes them much closer to operating at really suboptimal levels, or worse, having to shut down units entirely.
And Europe feels this pain immediately, even though the conflict would be thousands of miles away in the Caribbean. Just map out that connection for us one more time.
Absolutely. It's a direct kind of three-step chain reaction. First, Europe buys its fuel at global prices. So any disruption in Venezuela instantly means higher costs for European industries, for consumers, for you. Simple supply and demand.
Okay, standard market stuff.
But here's the critical piece, the connection that's really tightened recently. Since the war in Ukraine started, Europe has become heavily reliant on U.S.-produced diesel and gasoline to replace the Russian supplies they lost.
Oh, okay. So if the heavy crude feedstock for those U.S. refineries gets cut off or even just reduced,
Then the whole U.S. refining machine slows down.
and Europe loses its main reliable source of ready-made diesel fuel.
Precisely. If those complex U.S. refineries slow down because they're starved of the right heavy crude, their output of diesel, the fuel that literally powers European trucks, trains, heating, industry, it drops instantly. The domino effect on fuel prices for Europe would be immediate, and it would be severe, because they don't have many quick alternatives for getting that high-quality, high-volume diesel elsewhere. I mean, sure, Middle Eastern and Indian refineries could potentially soften the blow eventually, but those supplies are mostly already spoken for, and they'd come at a much higher cost. They couldn't fill the gap quickly.
This analysis has been really crucial. It shows how, the actual chemical makeup of oil, not just the abstract volume, dictates market stability and dictates the geopolitical moves.
That really is the essential lesson from this source material, especially when you look at energy geopolitics. In the early stages, the chaotic stages of a conflict like this one could be chemistry and geography count more than the overall global supply numbers. You just can't substitute the right molecule fast enough when things go wrong.
So, given that vulnerability, what's the strategic priority the sources highlight for Europe? What should they be doing?
The priority has to be defensive preparation, really. It means rigorously trying to diversify sources of heavy crude feedstock where possible. That's hard. It means strengthening domestic fuel stocks, especially diesel, building up reserves, and it means having advanced logistics planning ready to go to manage these kinds of rapid market shocks if or when they happen.
And that brings us to the final kind of provocative thought, doesn't it? Summing up the whole strategic view here.
Yeah, the sources frame the decision-making process, maybe in Washington, by referencing that old Eisenhower insight. Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. The implication being, Washington has definitely run the models on these scenarios. They've done the planning. So according to this analysis, the question might no longer be if the U.S. will act against Venezuela, whether it's to reassert regional dominance or secure long-term energy interests, but maybe when, and how those predictable economic and geopolitical shockwaves will ripple outwards, potentially pulling Russia, China, and Iran deeper into a dangerous new global game, one that stretches far beyond just the Caribbean.
So what does this all mean? It means the world's supposedly stable oil supply. It isn't just one big pool of energy. It's a really finely tuned chemical system optimized for specific types of crude. And right now, perhaps the most fragile, chemically specific piece of that system is sitting right on top of a major geopolitical fault line. Something for you to think about.